So let's talk about the plucky Primaris open-top transport with the Impulsor, and with its very solid recent points decrease, how good are they looking in Warhammer 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a focused unit review for the Impulsor, the open-top Primaris transport, delivering your intercessors and friends into battle on a fast-moving wave of anti-grav. In the video we'll talk briefly about the model kit, then go over the datasheet with its transport rules, weapons and defense, some possible squads that you might think about transporting in one, and how they might stack up overall in-game. The Impulsor is the Primaris dedicated transport. In the same way that maybe Gladiator tanks are kind of equivalent to Predator tanks, these guys basically feel like the Primaris version of a Razorback or Rhino tank. They only transport 6 and they can have a gun mounted on them, which maybe makes them feel a little bit more like a Razorback, though it might just partly be a size and scaling thing. The classic Rhino would realistically struggle to fit 10 tactical marines in volume wise. In any case, the Impulsor is a fast moving light transport for the Primaris, zooming across broken terrain on anti-grav plates and backed up by some powerful thrusters at the back. It is particularly known for its speed. The plastic kit from Games Workshop I think is kind of expensive, £50, €65 or $80, and to be honest, for the mainline transport of the Primaris Space Marines it's a bit disappointingly high really. In theory, if you did want a mechanised type force you might want lots of these, and it's surprising that they just cost so much more than the squads that they transport. Now it's down to just 85 points, it's only just north of 1 point per dollar, fairly dreadful by Warhammer 40k standards. Probably some of the overall best ways to get your hands on them are from the Blood Angels or Black Templars combat patrols, or people who've bought those kits and are reselling them on eBay or something. The kit is at least a fairly nice quality one. The Primaris vehicles are maybe a little bit divisive, some people like the grav plates, some people don't, but it does have a reasonable amount of options. You can have the choice of 4 different top hatch upgrades, and a choice between stubbers and fragstorm grenade launchers on the little sponsons. I feel like it does its part fairly well as a basic transport for the army. As always, if you are looking to pick these up a little bit cheaper, then feel free to check out the links down in the video description for sites like Element Games or Gap Games in Australia. Plenty of places do sell these cheaper than Games Workshop do directly, so generally worth bearing these other places in mind. Getting into the rules though, and I feel like the Impulsor is getting a lot closer to where it really needs to be. At time of recording it's had a fairly recent points reduction, 85 points at base, so dropped 10 points from 95. Previously for competitive lists it was kind of rarely played, but not to the extent where it was particularly unusable more casually I don't think. The points dropped around about 11%, so fairly appreciable. I think it will help it compete with other options, maybe competing with things like the Repulsors if you wanted a dedicated transport for Primaris. For its basic rules, its durability is fairly good. 11 wounds at toughness 9 and a 3+ save isn't bad at 85 points now. In general, transports tend to be fairly tough though, as they don't really have all that much damage. And obviously still dedicated anti-tank weapons will take it down quite quickly. It's 4 or 5 last cannon hits to bring down a single one, though it is quite resilient against medium strength or small arms type fire, much more than it used to be say in 9th edition. Otherwise, for its standard stats it moves 12 inches, it doesn't have the fly keyword anymore, previously it did do in previous iterations but not now. 12 inches is really quite quick to move it towards the midfield and jump out Primaris squads on objectives if you want to, or just get some lines of sight on enemy units if you're using it as a gunboat. Finally, I would note that it is a dedicated transport, it does need to have something start inside it. It's not allowed just to start the game empty. Dedicated transport does mean that you can take quite a lot of them if you want to, though I feel like it's still probably best as a bit of a luxury pick, maybe 1 or perhaps 2 to deliver some elite forces into battle, either onto objectives or into the enemy army, but I'm not particularly convinced that full mechanised Primaris would be a particularly efficient one compared with having plenty of troops on foot. Getting onto its actual transport rules, the Impulsor can take 3 Primaris infantry, either ones with the Tacticus or Phobos keywords, though with the Primaris range continually expanding, that does encompass quite a few things now. It still will be locked out of a few units like the Space Marine Vanguard Veterans or Devastator squads, both of which maybe could have been okay to put in this. The transport capacity of 6 means that you can have a 5-man unit with a character attached, though it can be a little bit unhelpful for the Blade Guard veterans that come in squad sizes of 3 or 6. It is a bit annoying that you can't have a max-sized squad of them plus a character in the Impulsor, as otherwise that would have been really quite a reasonable setup. For more ranged units though, you can fire shots out of it with the firing deck 6, so basically units can fire their weapons as if they were equipped on the Impulsor themselves, though it does mean that they won't be able to make use of any special rules they might have. Say for example, the Stern Guard couldn't make use of their datasheet rule to fire a second volley of things because it's embarked in the transport. Usually that might mean for a few shooting units that firepower isn't going to be quite as exciting coming out of an Impulsor compared with just on foot. I'd say maybe things like the Phobos Marines perhaps feel a little bit pointless to push in a transport like this. Often they tend to be able to forward deploy or scout or things, and it just means that the extra movement that this thing can get isn't really worth it to get them there when they can do it quite well themselves. Plus delivering them from a pure damage point of view doesn't tend to be that efficient. I'll go through these a bit more in a second, but maybe the Eliminators might be one exception for the Phobos. They do have really quite good damage output with their las fusils. Hellblasters can quite happily fire a whole bunch of plasma at the back of one of these. Blade Guard is still good for a bit of a countercharge bunker. Stern Guard with their devastating wounds. Black Templar Sword Brethren, or even just cheap troops like Intercessors or Assault Intercessors if you just want to move some power armor quickly onto midfield objectives with high objective control. To help out with its transport a little bit, the Impulsor does get a special rule called Assault Vehicle. This means that units can disembark from the transport after the transport has advanced. So if it's absolutely critical that you need to move a little bit further before the squad gets out, then that could be an option. Might be important occasionally for just making it onto an objective if you had to move around some terrain or something, or if that's going to get the difference between getting line of sight or range on an enemy unit if you were thinking about getting the unit out of it. I feel like it's maybe not the most strong rule overall, as often you're going to just be sacrificing the impulse of shooting by doing that, unless you happen to be in Devastator Doctrine that turn. And besides just moving high objective control units onto midfield objectives, a lot of the time the units inside might not necessarily need to get out, they could just fire away from inside it as it has firing deck. Maybe not the worst in Gladius though, where if you happen to be in Devastator Doctrine at the time when it matters, then you could do both. Might be just a little bit of an advantage for standard Space Marines there. Otherwise, for the guns that the Impulsor gets, you get an Iron Hail Heavy Stubber just included for free, and then either Storm Bolters or Fragstorm Grenade Launchers on its little sponsons. Between all that, it is at least fairly threatening to enemy light infantry. That's really quite a lot of strength 4 shots coming out at medium sort of range, just around 18 or 24 inches. I feel like the Fragstorm and the Storm Bolters are a fairly well balanced in 10th edition. The Fragstorm is going to be a bit better against anything that gets a boost with Blast, but Storm Bolters do have the advantage of being able to fire in combat if you need to. Out of the two, I'd probably be a little bit more tempted by the Fragstorm myself now. If you fired 2 of those and an Iron Hail Heavy Stubber against a 10 model Termagant squad, then you'd kill around about 5 of them. But going to struggle against anything that's tougher than that. Say for example you only do 1 or 2 wounds to a standard Chaos Legionary or enemy Intercessor. Then finally for the datasheets, and perhaps one of the most interesting bits, the top hatch gives you the choice of one of 4 different upgrades. These ones are the Bellicaster's missiles, the Shield Dome, the Orbital Comms Array, or the Iron Hail Sky Talon Array. And I feel like this time around Games Workshop has actually done a fairly reasonable job of balancing them quite well. The missiles are generally going to be at least somewhat useful at firing against most targets, either another blast shot against hordes, a mid sort of strength one with anti-fly 2+, or a crack one that's strength 8 and damage d6. None of them are really all that good against vehicles and things due to usually wounding them on a 5+, but should be at least fairly useful against very light vehicles or most infantry. The Shield Dome gives it a 5+ invulnerable save, which is helpful as it basically helps the transport's primary purpose, getting units where they need to go safe. In 10th edition it's maybe a little bit more niche than other places though. The invulnerable save is only going to come up against things that are AP3 out of cover or AP4 if you're in cover. It will come up, but maybe just not all the time. The Orbital Comms Array allows you a little bit of a command point regeneration. Anyone using a stratagem within 6 inches of it gets a command point back on a 5+. The strength of that maybe depends on what you're thinking of doing with the rest of your army. If it's not moving up in tandem with the Impulsor, then that's not going to be so good, and it also wouldn't stack with other command point gaining type things, so it depends if you've got anything else that generates them like Marnius Calgar. Finally, the Iron Hail Sky Talon Array is much more of just a light infantry killing thing, 8 shots at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1, with anti-fly 4+ and sustained hits. I guess that's just absolutely doubling down on anti-infantry. Say if you had Fragstorm grenade launchers plus the Iron Hail stubber within 18 inches, that's be really quite a big 22 strength 4 shots at that kind of range, and that is quite a lot of volume fire to be fair. Overall, I kind of feel like the choice is maybe a little bit opponent dependent, and some things are going to be better against some armies or worse against others. I feel like the missile may be just some fairly solid added value most of the time. The shield dome's hardly a bad upgrade though, as it actually helps out the transport with its primary purpose, though I guess in some games where you're playing against armies with lighter infantry, having an extra 8 sustained hit strength 4 shots at fairly long range will definitely help out on an aggressive unit. I'd say probably the comms array is the most niche out of any of them, just feels like you'd need to be using multiple stratagems within range of it to see any real value. Overall though, I think it's looking fairly attractive for 85 points right now. Delivers a squad of Space Marines into battle at fairly good speed, is reasonably tough for the cost, though as you'd expect folds to anti-tank weapons quite well, and then does actually have some threat on its own, particularly for gunning down a bunch of light infantry. Cycling back to transport options, I feel like these might be some of the better uses, maybe 5 Hellblasters or Stern Guard, and they could be firing out the back of it. The Hellblasters could potentially have the hazardous checks go off on the Impulsor itself, so they damage that rather than damage themselves, at least for the first port of call. And then if the Impulsor destroyed and they start taking subsequent casualties, they can still use their shoot on death thing. In theory, you could use lieutenants or support characters, though I feel like the buffs go a little bit less far on the smaller units. If you're using characters, it might well be a little bit more tempting to use a fighter unique melee character or something, along with some assault intercessors or standard intercessors, more as a way of delivering the character than anything else. Otherwise, 6 blade guards seem pretty reasonable as well, a bit of a battlefield bunker for them to charge out of. Probably the best assault unit that standard Space Marines can put in there, and it does help them get around their issue of low speed. As I said previously though, I feel like it's a real shame that they can't take a character in addition to a max size squad. If they could, then that might be one of the best things to put in the Impulsor. Otherwise, for eliminators, you could either field them with a sniper boss with a whole bunch of bolt snipers, or las fusils. They won't get the devastating wounds when they're stationary if they're within the transport, as they don't get their special rule, but still that's a lot of fairly mobile firepower. And with a lot of these squads in these transport, you could potentially try and move it and end it up near cover, so if the transport's destroyed, then you could disembark out of line of sight and keep them safe. I believe the Eliminators might still have a gamey trick that can still be done. I'm genuinely unsure if they wound up patching it in the designer's commentary at some stage, but as best I can tell they haven't so far. Eliminators can use their Instigator Bolt Carbine to move, shoot, move, and I believe that move, shoot, move can allow them to embark in the Impulsor. Technically that means that as the Impulsor hasn't fired yet, you can still fire with the firing deck and actually get them to shoot twice inside one turn. That definitely feels like it's rules abuse though, as opposed to a clever tactic or anything like that. Clearly doesn't seem to be intended if they haven't patched it, and please let me know down in the comments if they have anywhere. I'll post a correction. It does seem very clearly unintended, and it's not something I'd make use of myself, I think. Otherwise, just throwing intercessors or assault intercessors towards midfield objectives seems okay. For buffs, I'd say that it's not the biggest thing for the Impulsor. It's not really something I'd consider a focal unit. It does the supporting, not the other way around, so probably not best to make any big investments in it. Just for standard Gladius Space Marines, Oath of Moment will help it with damage like it does with everything else. As mentioned, the Devastator Doctrine is probably the most important for its advance and drop rule. That's presuming you do want to get units out after it's moved in the first place, which you might not necessarily want to if they just remain embarked and keep shooting. Otherwise, stratagems are fairly niche. You could use Storm of Fire for some extra AP or ignores cover. You could use Armor of Contempt to keep it a little bit more durable, or you could use Tank Shock. All of them feel a bit lower yield than on most other units in the Space Marine army, but if you do think that it's got the chance of making quite a big swing in the game, then by all means go for it. For specific chapters, I feel like the Impulsor works kind of similarly for most of them. For chapters like Blood Angels or Space Wolves could be interesting for maybe delivering units like the Death Company Intercessors or just Assault Intercessors with their own detachment boosts, but most of them are pretty limited in what sort of units it can take, as most of them haven't seen Primaris updates yet. Realistically, I think that the Impulsor is far more interesting for the Black Templars though. They get to replace the Iron Hail Heavy Stubber with a multi-melter if they want to. In general, I'd say that's going to be easily worth the trade, a fairly threatening anti-tank weapon in place of one that kills some light infantry. I think that's really quite a big win on a unit that's usually going to want to get close anyway, and comes completely for free now. Their core rule from their detachment is quite good for it as well, giving it a 6+ feel no pain type save often when they choose that vow. And I'd say the Black Templars maybe have perhaps the single best units to transport in an Impulsor, which is the Sword Brethren. Nicely efficient Primaris melee veterans that can jump out of it and go charging off into the enemy. They'll definitely appreciate both the extra protection and the extra speed, and they fit actually quite neatly into this transport with the option to take a character along, maybe Helbrecht. Overall feels like a strong choice for the Black Templars if you aren't going fluffy Land Raiders or anything. Overall, I feel like Games Workshop's latest points change for them has made them a fair bit more interesting, seem fairly usable in game currently, relatively cheap, relatively tough, and some okay volume fire. And Space Marines do have a fair few units that could credibly want to be transported, things like Sternguard or Hellblasters out of the main set. Sword Brethren and Black Templars do seem stand out as well. Perhaps for the main competition, the repulsor tanks might be one of the other things to look at. They can actually take a big 10-man squad that's quite good for synergy. Obviously a much bigger investment though, and you kind of want to have them as sort of mainline damage dealers, instead of just being a cheap and cheerful transport. In any case, let me know what you make of the new Impulsor points cost down in the comments below. Could you see yourself using these in competitive lists at the moment? And if so, what will be your favourite units to transport? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.